feature presentation.
Welcome back to another Untitled movie review. I'm one of your hosts, Matt Rohrbeck. Alongside, he's allergic to tomatoes, but he is tomato meter approved, Eric Marchin.
Matt, how are you?
I'm doing well, man. How about you?
I'm good. We'll talk about it on the regular show, which you can go listen to, I guess, right now even. We just had Canadian Thanksgiving, so we're coming back from a long weekend.
Took last week off a little bit too, so apologies if people were looking for us,
no,
but we
Matt,
kind of
don't apologize. You're about to move, again, and that, as many people know, is very, very stressful and understandable. That you need some time to kind of sort things out and get ready for that sort of change. So like, there's nothing wrong with that. And also, I've been going through some health stuff, which is now looking, better in terms of peace of mind.
Okay, good. We'll talk about that off air, but I haven't
Yes.
talked to you. We haven't really spoken all that much. Like we've texted here and there, but I mean, this is a little bit inside.
We hung out on my birthday, so it wasn't like
we did. And then you
Which
didn't
is
have an
only
update
on Friday.
then, which we will talk about on the main show, or we have talked about, depending on, we haven't recorded it yet, but it's available for you now.
For everybody wanting to listen to like what we have to say about the last Duel, they're just like, get to it already.
Yeah. Anyways, let's get to that. All of that will be on the new episode of the Untitled Movie Podcast, which you guys should go subscribe to on podcast services everywhere, or go watch on YouTube if you would like. But yes, today we are giving you an I always get this messed up because people used to go, I went to an advanced screening. No, it's an advance screening, because it's not like advanced, anyways.
Advanced Chemistry 101.
Yeah, exactly. We are reviewing Sir Ridley Scott's The Last Duel, starring Matt Damon, Adam Driver, Jodie Comer, Ben Affleck, and more.
The most French of actors you could
we'll get into that. Which I get it, but it's still distracting, especially for the subject matter that this film kind of covers. One of my biggest criticisms, probably, I'll get to. Eric, let's just get right into it. What is The Last Duel?
Yeah, so The Last Duel is Sir Ridley Scott's sort of attempt at doing a Rashomon style narrative, where we see three perspectives broken down into three chapters. Ben Affleck and Matt Damon co-wrote this adaptation alongside Nicole Holofcener. This is the first time that Affleck and Damon have worked together on a script since Good Will Hunting, which is
wild,
27 years ago now. And then even when you consider Ridley Scott's career, his first movie was The Duelist, which was about two petty officers in Napoleon's army dueling over the course of these three battles over the decades, and how history was changing. And they were played by Keith Carradine and Harvey Keitel. Again, when you think of French actors, you don't necessarily think of two Americans first and foremost. But that film was 44 years ago. And so there's this kind of weird symmetry with him doing kind of another story in that vein, but instead of two characters that are fighting over, very thin-skinned, petty kind of differences, you have a film that is trying to reflect contemporary sort of society, and also look back at how horrible things were in France in the 1300s, where
like systemic misogyny, essentially.
Yeah, and especially with the dealings of the church being so prominent in how a case like that was sort of dealt with back then.
Right. You could be tried by the church, essentially.
Yeah, and that's why I think that conversation has come up in the centuries moving forward, that you need the separation of church and state. Going into the narrative itself, what you have is a story that is focused on three characters. One, bit of his own worst enemy type character, played by Matt Damon, Sir Jean Le Carrouge, who is basically living in the shadow of his father, and has lost his wife and child as we first are introduced to him, and then soon after remarries Lady Marguerite, who's played by Jodie Comer, who's probably best known for Killing Eve, but was also in Free Guy earlier this year. And sort of their relationship being based not on love or happiness, but more so on Sir John's point of view of getting this dowry that comes along with it, and sort of keeping himself in standing, with society, and also having to pay taxes under the new administration run by Lord Pierre, who's played by Ben Affleck in a supporting role, which is kind of interesting because he was supposed to play the Adam Driver role originally, but decided to step down after certain allegations came up with him, which does make sense because the character that Adam Driver plays, Jacques Legris, who is Lord Pierre's sort of most a trusted advisor and squire, is sort of the villain of the piece, and essentially what the story is sort of culminating to is a duel between these two knights, a duel to the death that's dictated by not only French law but Christian uh, rhetoric that one man must kill the other in order to
God will
prove,
choose
yeah,
kind
and
of who should survive. Yeah.
to prove who is right.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
And the allegations that are being sort of discussed is a rape. Um, and as we see this story sort of unfold three times through three different perspectives, the story does carefully consider certain elements in terms of how to tell the story. And I think that for a studio film, there are aspects that I really admired, that it isn't, you look at the relationship between Lady Marguerite and Sir John, this isn't a love story at all. Like,
No.
there's no ounce of it. It's all for, profit and status. Like,
Her
there's nothing.
father is a coward or something, right? Who
A
betrayed,
traitor.
like
He's a
a
traitor
traitor.
to
Yeah.
Lord Pierre, and so he's also trying to make amends. So doing that, it's all
He like
strategic.
weds off his daughter to
Yeah, and with
Bruges.
that, you
Yeah.
get a dowry, which that also plays a very pivotal part in that Damon wants a certain part of land, but that's been given to Pierre because the father owes back taxes, and in doing so, Lord Pierre bequeaths that piece of land to Adam Driver's character. So throughout this whole story, we're seeing, the first chapter focuses on Damon's character, the second chapter focuses on Driver's character, and then the third focuses on Comer's character. And each chapter says, from the point of view of this person, from the point of view of this person. But I wanted to get into your review of the film before we kind of dive even deeper, because you brought up some really, I think, important points with how the narrative omits things when in a Rashomon style story. What is so clever about that narrative structure is that it repeats the same thing over and over again to the point of mundanity, where you're supposed to almost feel like it's a tedious procedural, but the point that it's making is that, there are finite differences within the same scene that you're watching, and there are moments like that in the film,
But
but
it's inconsistent, I
yes.
feel. Yeah, and so yeah, I'll just kick it off. I'm very mixed on the movie. I love Sir Ridley Scott. Again, hit or miss later in his career. He's just pumping out movie after movie after movie, and some are better than others, which is totally fine. But this specifically, I felt, one, with the subject matter that the movie is trying to kind of cover, it felt kind of strange to me that it's like mostly written by Affleck and Damon, and you bring Nicole Hofstetter in, and she, obviously that's much needed in a movie like this, but you're directed by Ridley Scott. Would have liked to see this movie from a woman directing it. Personally, that's, I guess, one thing that we can get into a little bit later. But then when it comes into the actual structure of the movie, me, love chapter based storytelling. I even love the Rashomon style, like, here's three different perspectives of the same events, that might be slightly different. Who should we believe? Who is telling the truth, kind of thing? How do people perceive different interactions, even though they're the same interactions? But what the movie does, I found the editing to be kind of the biggest kind of whiff for me in the entire thing, where even in the opening chapter or even the prologue and things like that, it felt chopped up and very disjointed right off the bat. And I'm just like, this feels weird. Like big chunks of the story are missing or omitted, or it just jumping around, like, and time frames just not
Well, especially in
sort
that
of,
first act, right?
yeah, in the first act specifically. And it just jumps around and you're from different perspectives. It's not just like you said, it is kind of from Carouge's perspective in that first chapter, but it still kind of tells you bits and pieces of the story from all over the place. So right away, I'm like, the editing in this movie just feels completely off. And then you start to kind of see what they're doing, which is like, oh, they're going to tell this story from three different perspectives. And like what you said is, in that, I would have loved to see, not putting into what I would love to see, but why I don't think the movie works is because they take scenes that were omitted intentionally from that first chapter where all characters are present, or at least the character from this perspective was in that first scene. It's just we took it out of that first chapter and just only showed it to you in this second chapter, saying it's from the perspective of, of Jacques Legris. And except it was also from the perspective of Carouge. We just didn't see it in his perspective because it was more convenient for the storytelling to only show you later. And it was that kind of stuff that kind of irked me throughout the whole movie, where we were getting it from these different perspectives. But I'm like, you guys got to make up your mind of, are we getting this from other people's perspectives, or are you just telling this in like a non-linear format? And it tries to have its cake and eat it too, where it's like doing both of those things. And I just feels super, super messy. So when you're watching chapter 2, which is supposed to be from a different person's perspective, but you're getting a scene where Carouge is clearly in the scene and you just left out that chunk because from a storytelling perspective, that beat would be more effective if I showed it later or give you a different piece of the story. It feels kind of weird and disjointed throughout the entire thing. And I think you start to see that, and you get more of that when you see it from Marguerite's perspective as well, and you're seeing bits and pieces of a scene that were just completely omitted from before just because it's quote unquote better that I showed it to you later. And then you're also getting what we're saying with the Rashomon style, or the different perspective style, where certain scenes play out, but they play out very differently. And I think that works.
Especially, I mean, you should mention with that where it comes to
Yeah.
like certain lines of dialogue are
Yeah.
said by certain characters in one chapter, and then they're said by another, and then
Yeah.
they're said by someone else entirely in the third. And that's like the kind of thing that's like, your classic interpretation of how, the
Events.
events,
Yeah.
the how the truth unfolds through the eyes of each sort of main party. And
Mm-hmm.
Akira Kurosawa, did something very similar when he made Rashomon, where you're taking one horrific crime and seeing it from the point of view of the same people. But what he did, instead of what Ridley Scott does here, is he showed you every scene over and over again. And I almost feel that whether it was Ridley Scott or somebody, on the studio side of things, was thinking like, okay, well, we can't have the same film just repeated over and over again with subtle nuances or, specificities. We need, to give the audience additional coverage throughout. And like, it makes sense when you have scenes with Driver and Ben Affleck's character, Pierre, where they are kind of almost like the Ben Affleck Matt Damon and what you would expect like a buddy comedy to be, weirdly, and sort of that kind of broism of France at that time. And like, I understand that, okay, yeah, Lady Marguerite and Sir Jean are not present in those scenes, so it's okay to include those moments to maybe
Sure.
add some additional sequences. But when, to your point, when you have those three characters present in any one scene, and then you insert something new within the second or third sequence that wasn't in the sequence before but was in the same location with the same characters, it does feel disingenuous to the narrative itself more so than anything. And then that's not even including your point that you made with having a male director sort of tackle something that is very much a sort of Me Too style storyline told in the 1300s. But I will say this for Sir Ridley Scott: of the male filmmakers, he has always been very pro female, female forward when it comes to his protagonists, whether it be in Alien or Thelma and
Absolutely.
Louise, GI Jane. Like, he's one of those guys that's like, okay, if you're going to give a male director a somewhat heavy, because again it's divided into three stories, and it's from the point of view of three people. It's not just from Comer's character's perspective, but at least it is a guy who does seem to be, very much pro female in
And I
terms of his
agree. Like I don't think
characters.
he's I don't think that feels disingenuous, and I'm totally okay with some of his profile and stature, and his ability to get a movie like this made to tell this story. That being said, I do wish that maybe he produced the movie or something like that, and maybe had his hand in it a little bit as like a hands-on producer. But I just feel like, again, going back, not just from that editing to what we're talking about here, like it just still feels very masculine at times,
Oh,
especially
sure.
when you're covering this subject matter that I think is so important, especially right now. And if you're using that to juxtapose of how it was, back then, and how not a lot has changed since then, that I just feel like you need, it just felt like, especially ending on this big, bombastic, thrilling, violent duel, and
Which
you might
Ridley
go,
Scott is very good at.
good
Like
at, and
he can do that
it's
in his sleep.
and it's great. It's an exciting duel. Like there's a lot of stuff in this movie, those big battles and stuff like that all looks fantastic, is exciting, violent. But then that to me takes away from what the core of what this movie is about.
Which is a
And
chamber piece in a lot of ways, right?
yeah,
Because it's a conversation usually between two or three characters or supporting characters. It has a kind of masterpiece theater quality to it, where like the trial itself, I think, should have been more of the centerpiece, where that comes into
where
the
you could get the
end of
different
each
perspectives,
chapter,
right?
right?
Like,
Yeah,
and
exactly.
like you could use that as the framing device instead of going, well, I want to do it non-linear and I also want to show from different perspectives. And then it just becomes confusing and feels chopped up. And then when you get this very masculine fight at the end of it, and even though some people might go, well, that's the point of it, right? Especially with how the movie ends, we won't go
Especially
into that.
overshadowing, the actual allegations and the
Yes.
victim
And I
herself.
get that that's probably the point of it, right? But it still feels like it takes away from, like, I don't think it ended on a spot where it really it does and it doesn't, and it's hard to go into it because I don't, even though it's like, you can read what happened, but it's not like it's spoiling that
Well,
much.
yeah,
But
it's his historical moment,
yeah,
and it's based on Eric Yeager's book. So like
exactly.
it's
Yeah.
I mean, it's not a very it's maybe not as well known as some
That's
sort
why
of
I don't want to
trials. Yeah.
necessarily go into it. But that just felt kind of, I don't know, it just didn't completely work for me. And then on top of that, finally, and I don't want to sound too negative because I'll get into some of the positives, because I don't hate the movie, and I think it is, like we said, I think it's shot well. The action sequences are exciting. The acting is, I have a problem with casting Americans as these French guys, and like and that it does feel very popcorny Hollywood kind of, like you said,
Well,
sort
it's
of
like classic like
yeah.
1940s and 50s Hollywood, where you get these kind of big name actors to play roles that aren't maybe right for them in
No
terms of
one's
their
doing an accent.
nationality.
Everyone just sounds American, and even the way they say Jack Le Carouge or whatever, Jean
Right.
Le
Yeah, and
Carouge, like it's
even
just,
the makeup, I mean, and the
yeah,
makeup and the
and the hair,
hairstyling has been talked about a lot, where like
yeah,
Matt Damon could either be someone from the 1300s
or
or from the
1999.
1990s in Oshawa, Ontario. Um,
Thanks. Yeah. I'm
hey,
moving away in
I
two
know,
weeks,
I know.
so
But
again.
it's true. Like it just kind of feels like, both Ben Affleck and Matt Damon's character listen to Limp Bizkit, and
Yeah, and I think that's what again took me out of it. And it's, again, I go back, I'm like, I think the subject matter in this movie is so important and should be handled with such care, especially when
it
you're
shouldn't be
talking about,
mocked and
and
shouldn't
like,
be, yeah.
yeah, like when you're talking about sexual assault and things like that, like it's hard for me to take it seriously when you have Ben Affleck and Matt Damon in this hair and makeup with no accents at all.
Who are also very
Actually, it would
broy
probably be
actors in
worse,
general.
it would be worse if they tried to do French accents, to be honest. But
Yeah.
like, so when you have that kind of stuff in there, that takes me out of it. So like when you get to the part that, I think Jodie Comer is great in the movie, and her sequence is the best part,
I
and I
don't
think
think
she's
any.
fantastic.
I should say this. I don't
Yeah,
think anybody is actually bad in the
I
film. I think
agree.
that maybe the miscasting is one thing, but like what I actually do find really fascinating, and I've been thinking about this a little bit, pertaining to Matt Damon's career specifically, is he's now entered a phase where he seems very comfortable at playing unlikable leads or even supporting characters with this Stillwater and even the Steven Soderbergh movie No Sudden Move with his cameo in that, where you think of Matt Damon in the late 90s into the early 2000s, and this charming kind of affable leading man who has a penchant for both comedy and then surprise people with his action chops as well, is now playing characters who are their own worst enemies in a way. And the joke that both Stillwater and this, Matt Damon in France, is not a good combo for him. But I actually really like the idea that he's not afraid to play characters who are complete and utter assholes.
Yeah.
And that's something in this movie that I do think does take a risk, where like if you're watching the trailers for this, or if you're reading a synopsis only, you could think that there is kind of a nobility to the film, or that there is a love story between Comer and Damon's characters, and that
No,
this
everyone's
is a story
trash
about
except for
honor.
her.
Yeah, and I actually really do like that these characters are reprehensible and slimy. And yeah, Adam Driver's character is the worst, but that is only because it's facilitated by somebody like Lord Pierre. And even though Affleck I don't think is as good of an actor compared to Damon, Comer, or Driver, he weirdly almost reminds me a little bit of, speaking of another Boston actor, Mark Wahlberg in The Departed, where like
Sure.
he weirdly is kind of like the comedic relief slash he's kind of that supporting character that comes in every now and then and kind of interjects sort of a weirder
Hams it
tone,
up.
and
Yeah.
he doesn't really necessarily feel
Like he's in
like
the
he
same movie.
no
Yeah.
no like he almost feels like he would be in a film that was directed by Joel Schumacher or something like
And I
that.
agree with that, but then that goes back to my point of taking me out of it. And
Right, which I
especially
agree with
what,
as well.
like, again, if this movie was just, I don't know, not about what it's about, I could maybe buy into that a bit more.
Well, if it was
And
The Duelist, right? Like if it was
yeah,
just two guys fighting over, their reputation or
yeah,
standing, and feeling like the other one had, basically sullied their good name, that would be fine. And it's actually comical. Like I have the copy of The Duelist right here. Like you look at a movie like this and you think to yourself, like, it is ridiculous where you have two American actors, cast in French roles, battling over basically nonsense and
yeah.
killing each other in the process, or harming themselves to the point of where they're going to have to sort of live with those scars. But this, to what you're saying, is a much more serious matter in terms of it's not about pride and it's not about honor, even though those things are being presented. It's
Hmm.
those are the facades of what is ultimately a film about injustice at a time when women did not have a voice. And even though you know Comer's character has a champion in Damon's not doing it to honor her or defend her. He's only
Doing
doing
it
it
for
for
himself. Yeah.
his own stature, because one, he wants to be as good or better than his rival played by Driver, but also again living in the shadow of his father and feeling that he's owed something and that he's entitled to a way of life that he was accustomed to growing up.
Yeah.
Which I also do find that I do
I
find
do
that
too.
fascinating in
Yeah.
terms of the psychology. And the one thing again I actually really did like about this movie is how it is showing how religion and Christianity specifically had such a grip on the process of law at
Yeah.
that point, and how grateful I am to live in a time where, even though people still will swear on a Bible and things like
Sure.
that in
Yeah. Yeah.
court, but we've gotten to a point where science and logic seems to trump that stuff.
Yeah,
And
for the most part.
for the most
Yeah.
part, I'm not saying like, I mean,
Yeah.
we still have people that are anti-vaxxers and all that kind of stuff and believe in religion and things like that, but there is a sensibility now where we have evolved so much, but then in some other ways we haven't. And this movie does show that there is a regression
Mhm.
within that, especially where, like, there's a scene between Driver and Affleck where Affleck tells him that you've been accused and there's been rumors spreading, and that Driver, the way that he behaves is very much as the victim. It's like, oh, like, she's ruining my life and all this kind of stuff. And then we should also say that, trigger warning, there is a rape that is shown twice, and
Mhm.
it's
I'll
I
put
wouldn't
that at the front of this show actually, because I feel like I should have done that off the top. But so
it's not gratuitous and exploitative, I don't think, but then again, that's coming from my perspective, because I think what it's trying to
and it's
do.
shown twice, and I think it makes it, the first one's very uncomfortable. The second time is even more uncomfortable, which then makes the first one even more uncomfortable because
Yes,
of the way that it's kind of showing those two perspectives. So,
but there is a
yes,
point to it, instead of just kind of like showing it for the sake of being like, oh, how awful it was at this time period. Like, it's showing you again, like, how someone, how the perpetrator and the victim both perceive
the
that
same
moment.
events.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I again, the movie, I think, is at its best when it's showcasing those different perspectives, and I just felt like I just wish it was kind of consistent with that, where I felt like the chopped up editing just didn't completely work for me.
And it's way
Uh,
too long.
it
It's
is, yeah,
at nearly 3 hours.
yeah,
But again, that's kind of what you would expect from Sir Ridley Scott when he's doing, like, his
his big
two.
epics, yeah.
Yeah, whether he's doing sci-fi or historical period pieces, they're usually longer, so it's not surprising that it's going to be that long. And I mean, even the other day, people were saying, "Oh, Gucci's over 3.5 hours," but then it
But
was
now it looks like
clarified that
it's
it's going to be
two and a half,
yeah,
about the same length
yeah.
as this, right? So, yeah, and then Darius Volsky's cinematography, I feel like it has that cool blue kind of Ridley Scott look in a lot of scenes, and then obviously all that we talked about, the action sequences still look
But
fantastic.
visually speaking, again, there's this quality where you think like, oh, like, Ridley Scott is known as a visual filmmaker, and a lot of the scenes are very much like these small intimate moments that happen,
Like you said, like in
behind
a
closed
chambers or
doors
something,
or
yeah.
things like that. And so it kind of is similar to when he directed The Counselor, where with that movie, it's very talky, and it's again all about sort of, these monologues. And it kind of feels like it almost does him a disservice to make something like this. But then again, he's 84, and he's continuing to make movies, and I applaud him for wanting to do what he wants to do. It's the same way with Spielberg when we talk about him, where, like, just because you want him to continue to do action adventure movies in the vein of Jurassic Park and Jaws and ET, doesn't mean that he necessarily wants to do that, and he can do whatever he wants to do because he's earned the right to do that. And I feel the same way with Ridley Scott, where it's like, yeah, he's still doing sci-fi, he's still doing his period films, but if he wants to do something that's not necessarily a Gladiator, or something that is more action sort of
Sometimes he
adjacent.
sometimes he wants to, and we get Exodus, Gods and Kings. So,
Right, which is one of his worst films. But with this, yeah, I think I'm mixed positive, and the more I do
yeah,
think about it, there are things I do really like. But the points that you brought up specifically with the editing and the way that it omits it, I feel that narrative structure does the whole film not only a disservice, but it is disingenuine to telling a story that essentially didn't have to be spread out over nearly 3 hours long. And the Rashomon narrative doesn't have to always be on something that is necessarily horrific. I mean, we've seen it in movies like Vantage Point, or
sure,
even in something that's smaller and intimate as well, like The Disappearance of Eleanor Rigby, which
yeah.
it's him and her, and it's only two sides of the same story. Um, but I think overall, I'm just always really fascinated by what Ridley Scott's doing, especially like even now, where like he's trying to stay contemporary, even if he's setting a film in centuries past.
Yeah.
Or and I think that's maybe the most opportunistic aspect of the film, where it's like, okay, this is a Me Too style movie, and it's taking the temperature of what's going on now and reflecting what has happened in the past and how things don't change, but it doesn't maybe do it as well as some other movies have recently done. I mean, I know you loved it a little bit more than I did, but I think something like Promising Young
Yeah.
Woman, even though it's not a Rashomon style, but the narrative structure kind of does things that deviate from what you would expect a traditional revenge thriller to sort of proceed in, or eventually end up in. And so it's a conversation to continue to have, and I think that any period piece that does have a little bit of an edge to it, which this movie does, is worth watching, even though again it is very long. And I feel that you need to go to a theater that has really comfortable seats if you're willing to go to the theater at this time.
Yeah. I'm mixed negative. I'm gonna give. I don't hate the movie, but obviously I had some big issues, so I'm gonna give it a 2.5 out of 5.
And I'm going to give it a 3.5 out of 5. But I really do appreciate what you were saying with those criticisms, and I don't disagree with you. I think that they are not only valid, I think that they go against the movie overall.
Yeah, and I get why people enjoy the movie too, and I don't disagree that like more stories like this should be told, and even and Ridley Scott using his platform to do that is and obviously bringing in Nicole Hofstetter obviously was much needed, and I think who am I to say that she shouldn't be involved in this story, shouldn't be told by Ridley Scott, but I just, those issues with the casting and then the editing and stuff like that just kind of took me right out of it where I wanted it, to feel as important as it should. So, yeah, mixed negative for me. But thank you all for listening or watching. We really, really do appreciate it. The Last Duel will be out this Friday, October the 15th, in cinemas everywhere, only in cinemas. And then I'm sure it'll drop on, now that Disney owns Fox. I don't know what the theatrical windows are anymore. They're all different. So you'll be able to see it on streaming or something sometime soon if you don't want to spend the 2.5 hours in a theater. Um, like we mentioned, we have another show called the Untitled Movie Podcast, which we would love for you guys to check out. It's just Eric and I shooting the shit about the entertainment industry. We'll talk about Eric's birthday. We hung out and watched some horror comedies. We'll talk about the new Scream trailer. We'll talk about the casting of Will Poulter for Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. And much, much more. So go check that out. We'll also have other reviews this week for Halloween Kills. That should be coming to you guys probably Friday morning, the day of release, as well as Bergman Island, which you guys will get this week, which was our kind of one of our last TIFF stragglers that we decided to put out that review as the movie was coming out for everyone to enjoy.
Which will be available also day and date on October 15th.
Great. Fantastic. As always, my name is Matt Rohrbeck. You can find more of my work around the internet, but mostly at untitledmoviepodcast.com. And you can follow me on all those social medias at Matt Rohrbeck.
And I'm Eric Marchin. You can find more of my video reviews at rogerstv.com/cinemascene and on the social medias at EM6211.
Until next time.
I feel like some Dunkin' Donuts.